The wedding bells rang across Westminster Abbey, but they sounded more like a funeral dirge. Standing at the altar in 1472 was a young woman whose life had been shattered by the very man she was now being forced to marry. Princess Anne Neville, daughter of the mighty Earl of Warwick, was about to become the wife of Richard of Gloucester, the man who had helped destroy her father, murder her husband, and annihilate everything she had ever loved. This wasn't a marriage, it was the ultimate act of political revenge disguised as romance. But how did a princess who once commanded the respect of Europe end up as a pawn in the deadly game of medieval politics? This is the tragic story of Anne Neville, a woman whose life became a nightmare orchestrated by the future Richard III. Anne Neville was born into one of the most powerful families in 15th century England. Her father, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was known as the Kingmaker, a man so influential that he could place monarchs on thrones or tear them down at will. The Nevilles controlled vast estates across northern England, commanded private armies, and wielded power that rivaled the king himself. Anne grew up in this world of privilege and authority, educated in languages, music, and statecraft, destined to make a marriage that would strengthen her family's already formidable position. But the England of Anne's childhood was a realm in constant turmoil. The Wars of the Roses had turned the kingdom into a battlefield where noble families fought for ultimate control. The House of York, led by Edward IV, battled the House of Lancaster for the crown, and caught between them were powerful nobles like Warwick, who switched sides based on political advantage rather than loyalty. Anne's first taste of political marriage came when she was just 14 years old. In 1470, her father arranged her betrothal to Edward of Westminster, the teenage son of the deposed Lancastrian king Henry VI. This marriage was part of Warwick's stunning betrayal of his former ally Edward IV. The Kingmaker had decided to restore the Lancastrian dynasty and needed to cement his new alliance through his daughter's marriage. The wedding took place in France, where the exiled Lancastrian court had taken refuge. Anne found herself married to a prince who was passionate about reclaiming his birthright, but had never known anything but exile and struggle. Edward of Westminster was handsome and brave, but he was also reckless and violent traits that would ultimately prove fatal. For a brief moment, Anne was a Lancastrian princess with dreams of becoming Queen of England, but those dreams were shattered at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Warwick's rebellion had initially succeeded, briefly restoring Henry VI to the throne, but Edward IV had returned from exile with a vengeance. The decisive battle took place in the fields of Gloucestershire, where the fate of England would be determined in a single afternoon of slaughter. Anne watched in horror as the Yorkist forces, led by Edward IV and his brothers, including the young Richard of Gloucester, systematically destroyed the Lancastrian army. Her husband Edward fought bravely, but was overwhelmed by superior numbers and tactics. According to contemporary accounts, the young prince was killed either during the battle or immediately afterward. Some sources claim he was murdered in cold blood by the Yorkist princes, including Richard, after being taken prisoner. The aftermath of Tewkesbury was a nightmare for Anne. Her husband was dead. Her father-in-law, Henry VI, would be murdered in the Tower of London within weeks, and the Lancastrian cause was completely destroyed. But Anne's personal tragedy was just beginning. She was now a 16-year-old widow, stripped of her royal status, and completely at the mercy of the very men who had destroyed her world. Richard of Gloucester, Edward IV's youngest brother, saw opportunity in Anne's misery. She was still one of the greatest heiresses in England, entitled to half of the vast Warwick inheritance. More importantly, marrying her would legitimize Richard's claim to the Warwick lands and give him control over the powerful northern territories that had been the source of her family's strength. But there was a grotesque irony in Richard's pursuit of Anne. He was almost certainly one of the men who had killed her first husband. Contemporary chronicles suggest that Richard personally participated in Edward of Westminster's murder, either on the battlefield or in its immediate aftermath. Now, barely a year later, this same man was courting the dead prince's widow with the intention of making her his wife. Anne found herself trapped in an impossible situation. She had no male relatives left to protect her. Her father had died at the Battle of Barnet just weeks before Tewkesbury, and the rest of her family had been killed or exiled. Edward IV, now securely on his throne, saw political advantage in allowing his brother to marry the Warwick heiress. The marriage would neutralize any remaining Neville threat while rewarding Richard for his loyalty during the recent civil war. The negotiation of Anne's second marriage was conducted entirely over her head. She was treated not as a person with feelings and desires, but as a piece of valuable property to be transferred from one owner to another. Richard pressed his suit with the determination of a man who understood that this marriage would make him one of the most powerful lords in England. Anne's feelings about marrying her husband's killer can only be imagined. Medieval chroniclers, writing for male audiences, showed little interest in her emotional state, but the few contemporary accounts that mention her describe a young woman who seemed broken by her experiences, hollow-eyed and silent, going through the motions of life without any apparent joy or hope. The wedding ceremony itself was a study in political cynicism. Held at Westminster Abbey in 1472, it was attended by the great and powerful of England, all pretending that this was a normal dynastic marriage rather than the final act in the destruction of the House of Neville. Anne, dressed in the finest silks and jewels, looked every inch a princess, but contemporary observers noted that she seemed more like a beautiful ghost than a blushing bride. Richard, now Duke of Gloucester, through his marriage, wasted no time in claiming his wife's inheritance. The vast Warwick estates were divided between Richard and George, Duke of Clarence, who had married Anne's sister Isabel. The two brothers quarrelled bitterly over the division of the spoils, with Anne caught in the middle as they fought over her patrimony like dogs over a bone. Life as Richard's wife brought Anne little happiness. She was installed in his northern strongholds, far from the centres of power where she had once moved as her father's daughter. Richard was frequently absent on military campaigns or political business, leaving Anne to manage his estates and bear him an heir. Their son Edward was born around 1476, giving Anne purpose, but also making her even more valuable to Richard as the mother of his dynasty. Contemporary accounts of Anne's marriage paint a picture of a woman who had learned to survive by making herself invisible. She performed her duties as Duchess competently, but without enthusiasm, hosting feasts and managing households while showing little of the intelligence and spirit that had characterized her youth. The trauma of losing her first husband and being forced to marry his killer had apparently broken something essential in her character. The situation became even more twisted when Richard seized the throne in 1483, making Anne Queen of England. The woman who had once been married to a Lancastrian prince was now the wife of a Yorkist king. But her elevation brought no joy. By all accounts, Anne seemed terrified of her new position, perhaps understanding better than anyone the ruthless nature of the man she had been forced to marry. As queen, Anne was expected to play a public role, but she appeared increasingly frail and nervous. Contemporary observers noted that she seemed to be wasting away, growing thinner and paler with each public appearance. Some whispered that Richard was slowly poisoning her, preparing to remarry for political advantage. Others suggested that Anne was simply dying of grief and exhaustion, worn down by years of trauma and powerlessness. Anne's death in March 1485 was as tragic as her life had been. She died young, probably not yet 30, having lived through more political upheaval and personal tragedy than most people could imagine. Contemporary chroniclers recorded her death with little comment, treating her as a footnote to Richard's story, rather than a tragic figure in her own right. The timing of Anne's death was politically convenient for Richard, who was facing growing opposition and might have benefited from a new marriage alliance. Rumors immediately began circulating that he had murdered his wife, adding another crime to the growing list of accusations against him. Whether Anne died of natural causes, poison, or simply exhaustion from years of suffering, her death freed Richard to pursue new political arrangements. But Richard's freedom was short-lived. Just 5 months after Anne's death, he was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending his brief and bloody reign. Henry Tudor, the new Henry VII, moved quickly to portray Richard as a tyrant and usurper, and Anne's story became part of the narrative of his crimes. She was remembered as one of his victims, an innocent woman destroyed by his ambition. The tragedy of Anne Neville lies not just in her individual suffering, but in what her story reveals about the powerlessness of women in medieval politics. She was brilliant, educated, and born to privilege, but none of these advantages could protect her when the men in her life decided to use her as a political pawn. Her marriages were arranged without her consent, her inheritance was stolen from her, and her feelings were considered irrelevant to the great game of power. Modern historians have begun to reassess Anne's story, recognizing her as more than just a victim of Richard III's ambition. She was a woman who survived extraordinary trauma and managed to maintain her dignity in impossible circumstances. Her life reminds us that behind the great political dramas of history were real people whose hopes and dreams were crushed by forces beyond their control. And Neville's grave in Westminster Abbey bears no monument, no grand memorial to mark her passing. She lies forgotten among the kings and queens, a princess whose life was sacrificed to the ambitions of the men who claimed to love her. Her story serves as a permanent reminder of the cost of political power and the price that innocent people pay when history's great men decide to reshape the world. In the end, Anne Neville was both a princess and a prisoner, a queen and a victim, a woman whose life became a tragedy orchestrated by the future Richard III. Her wedding bells rang like a funeral dirge because, in many ways, her marriage to Richard was the death of everything she had once been and everything she might have become.